And we are still a minute or so before noon Pacific time. Hi, Jack.
Hey, Matt. How's it going?
I'm good. I knew I should have worn my American flag tie. Now you've embarrassed me because you're looking sharp. You look like you're ready to go up on the hill.
I'm heading to the hill right after this call.
Okay. That explains it. Casey, I'm glad to see at least you're a little bit more casual.
This is dressing up for me, Matt.
Yeah, well, that comes from living in the other Washington. Casey Dreier, of course, is the chief of space policy for the Planetary Society, while Jack Kirley is our man in D.C., the D.C.-based director of government relations for the Society. And look who was just named by the Advocacy Association in D.C. as one of its top 20 in 2024. Congratulations, Jack. That's quite an accomplishment.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, it's an honor to be selected to be among this group of people.
We can say our award-winning advocacy team at the Planetary Society.
Indeed.
That's absolutely true. It is a wonderful thing to see, and congrats. I also noted when you let the rest of the staff know about this, you're the only person among the 20 who has anything to do with the aerospace world. And Lord knows there's no shortage of advocates and lobbyists in DC working for that industry, right?
Absolutely. And so it's, the group that I'm honored to be among runs the gamut in different policy areas. But yeah, only one in the aerospace sector, which
well, congrats again.
Really nice to see.
Casey, I have just put in the chat, and I won't be able to update the chat much, I'm afraid. You guys are welcome to post anything you like. But I just dropped into the chat, everybody, Casey's recent piece called What to Watch For in a Second Trump Administration. Good for space, bad for NASA, which, Casey, we learn in the article, that's actually a quote that you got from an intern of ours. You want to mention her?
Yeah, we've been working with, Jack and I have been delighted to welcome a fellow from the Z Factor Fellowship, which is a fellowship dedicated to bringing in people with backgrounds that are underrepresented in the aerospace industry to work with various organizations and get real world experience. So Elizabeth Koenk is our Z Factor Fellow this year, and she's based in DC and works a lot with Jack in our government outreach, and has been working with me in a number of projects and advocacy analyses. And she's been a real delight to work with, and very excited to have her helping us out this busy fall. And she coined that term, and I thought it was very apt for kind of the situation we may be facing in the future.
And you do go into that. It inspired a good piece of that article, which some of you may have seen. I assigned that as your homework yesterday in preparation for this session, because we really do want to get as quickly as possible, like now, to your questions and comments. And I will mention that, Casey and Jack, I guess you're also going to be heard on Planetary Radio with our great colleague Sarah beginning tomorrow, right, when this week's episode comes out.
Yeah, that's great.
We're both on talking at length about this as well. So if you can't make it the entire day today, you can hear our fuller thoughts tomorrow, and in various news articles and other interviews around the internet these days. There's a lot to talk about, but not a lot we know, which is, I guess, is a fertile combination for lots of speculation and discussion at this point.
Jack, you may have already noticed that some of our members who have joined us live today, and by the way, if you're not joining us live, if you're watching the recording, we welcome you as well. Whether you are members of the Planetary Society or not, you know what's coming. We hope that you will consider becoming a member of the Planetary Society at planetary.org/join so that you can be part of these live events. We've got a live event this week, next week, the following week. That following week, it'll be Eric Berger, the great astro or space journalist, talking about his new book, Reentry. We have so much going on in the community for our members, because it is the member community. We hope you'll consider joining us. But we welcome you regardless. We did start to get some questions and comments, Casey, prior to the start of today's event, and I see that there are already some of our live participants who are throwing some things in. Let me go immediately, though, to some of the stuff that came in ahead of time. There are just some comments, like from Margaret. I'll watch for the recorded session afterward. I'm definitely interested in the perspectives of the group and likely impacts going forward, as are we, Margaret. Alan says, I have a bad feeling about NASA space exploration getting much of any support from the MAGA Republican control of Congress. Better hope they don't slash budgets so Elon can get his humongous tax break. This isn't me being political, just reality. Casey, you talk about this in your piece at planetary.org, the one that has the link in the chat. It's a good deal more complex than that.
It is, and this is why I think I liked Elizabeth's phrasing of this, that separates out NASA from space, and the idea that space itself, and this is an issue that has been on my mind quite a bit in the last year. And for those of you who listened to the Space Policy Edition on NASA at a Crossroads, the recent National Academies report from a committee led by Norm Augustine, heard me discussing as well, this idea that NASA as an institution is facing competition really for the first time in its existence. You know, it's obviously been building up the last few years, but I think we're at a real crossroads here where NASA acts like it is still the monopoly for facilitating access to space for the nation. Most of the ways it is, but public perception, particularly those who are not, unlike us, not members of the society, don't follow space very closely. You have companies like SpaceX with, like, for example, today with the upcoming Starship launch, occupying a larger and larger share of awareness and demonstrating incredible innovation and technological capability distinct from NASA. But NASA hasn't, I think, realized that it's in competition to a certain extent with commercial providers and politically speaking. And so the institution of NASA is facing a number of serious challenges that would be a major important item for any administration to focus on, and particularly the next administrator, whoever that might be. But we're entering into a very, let's say, interesting period of politics where we've added the range of things that can happen have expanded greatly. We don't know the likelihood at which those could happen. We don't know how likely radical change could be, but it's greater than zero, and it's certainly greater than it was under this administration. All that being said, and sorry for monologuing here, there is a lot to talk about.
Go ahead.
But I'll just want to address the first two questions about budget and about the kind of the political alignment of the incoming Congress and White House to NASA. I do think there's a lot of built-in sympathy and interest in space, and with NASA as well. And the first Trump administration, who had at least a larger House majority than this incoming one will have, and a Senate Republican majority, ultimately did some very, very smart space policy, began the Artemis program, established the Artemis Accords, and designed it in such a way that it was one of the vanishingly few programs and policies that were embraced functionally entirely by the subsequent Biden administration. That gives me some, I think that should give all of us some pause to just kind of evaluate that there may be opportunity here for ongoing, there's lots of interest, I'd say, in space, and budgets are going to be a more challenging issue for a number of reasons that we can get into, but basically that the overall budget, the attitude towards cutting is much larger now, just broadly across the federal government, and NASA tends to go as federal budgets go and discretionary spending. So even if there's no, and so this is one way to think about this, even if there's no targeted effort towards NASA, there's no attention paid towards NASA, there's no attack on NASA, NASA could still suffer budget cuts by nature of there just being less money to go around. So those are, those are related but kind of distinct issues. But there's opportunity in policy and priority, and I think there's a lot of interest in it. So that's a good starting point.
Jack, before I go to you, I want to bring out something else that I learned from Casey's article, which is that even within NASA, there may be uneven treatment between the different NASA divisions. You point out the Science Mission Directorate, where so much of the work that we most care about in the society may be particularly vulnerable, and that a lot of the science work happens at centers and facilities in blue states, California, Maryland. A lot of the human spaceflight stuff happens in red states.
Yeah, I mean, so there certainly is a connection between the geography of these programs and the policies that are prioritized by a given administration or given Congress. But I will say there is still a distinction between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And so though the president will have executive authority and have the ability to set big picture policy and work with the National Space Council and other entities within the federal government to advance a certain slate of policy proposals, they will also still have to work with Congress, all 535 members, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate, to come to some consensus on the future of federal priorities. And though there are, a big picture, right? We have in California and Maryland are predominantly blue states on the national stage. There are still Republicans that represent those states, right? And so they will certainly be in the majority. And I think maybe what's going to matter a lot in these coming months is as the Congress, the Republican majority in the House and the Senate, in determining who is going to chair and lead these various appropriations and authorizing committees, is going to sort of help determine what that direction is. If it is maybe more slanted towards human spaceflight, we may see more members from the Alabama and Florida and Texas delegations having sort of a higher profile, or we may see a changing of the guard, so it were. And there may be opportunities, right, to bridge those what maybe on the surface might look like political gaps, right, between Maryland, California on one side and Alabama and Texas on the other, but be able to work together on a space program that lifts up all of the different activities, because like Casey's article points out, and I think we've been talking about in multiple of these, science is under a lot of strain right now. There's a lot of downward pressure being created within all of NASA. The budget's not growing. I think Administrator Nelson says it's trying to fit 10 pounds of program into a 5-pound sack. It's very important, I think, for all delegations, because every state receives some amount of money in NASA funding, whether that's in grants or contracts, or they have a NASA center or facility in their district. Everyone, I think, wants to see the program succeed, and it's about communicating what those priorities are in the coming years.
And I'll add to that, Matt. I mean, my point was with the difference of representation of human spaceflight centers and science centers wasn't necessarily that there's a partisan aspect at play, but more that there's just an institutional and structural advantage in the current makeup of Congress, that the Republicans are in the majority in the Congress and the White House. That just gives them more leeway in legislating, that they run the committees, they write the first drafts of the bills, and ultimately they control the pace of legislation. So, I mean, I think this is what I like to zoom out of like, we can put some of the politics and partisanship just to the side and just look at the structural incentives that we're going to have in the system, and mix that with human spaceflight occupying a international and geostrategic position among U.S. national interest. We've already seen, to Jack's point, that within a Democratic administration and mixed control of Congress, that as NASA's budget has diminished even a couple of percent, the funding has been preserved for human spaceflight, and that has come at the cost of science, in this situation. So if that top line continues to slide, I can see that persisting. Now, there's going to be some X factors here that we'll talk about that could mix this up a little bit, and this is where we start getting into a lot of speculation. But in general, the incentives are just lining up against NASA science as a consequence of these larger issues at play.
Here's a very relevant question, I think, that came in from Doug. What budget do you think there will be for Artemis-related robotic landers on the moon that could be more fully successful? Because Artemis does include the robotic exploration, the precursors to putting the footprints back up there.
That's a good question that I don't have a way to answer yet. I think so. Let's jump back though, because I think the moon. There's a lot right now in particular. There's a lot seems up in the air. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's no clear. The Trump campaign didn't have any clear space policy as part of its campaign, nor did the Harris campaign. And we have lessons we can learn from the first administration, but the next Trump administration is shaping up to be substantially different, at least in the personnel and the strategy. And if nothing else, Mike Pence was a vice president, was a huge fan of space. And JD Vance doesn't seem to be that at best. So with now, Elon Musk obviously has joined as the pseudo advisor, close advisor to Trump. And so we have this alignment between the CEO and founder of the most capable private space company ever, and an incoming administration that has majorities in Congress. And Trump himself has spoken on the campaign trail multiple times about humans to Mars and SpaceX getting things to Mars, and maybe by the end of his first term, doing a Mars shot.
Yeah, good luck.
So this calls into question this larger strategy of Artemis as the moon, which he himself signed into policy and into law as both by NASA authorizations and national space policy. So the question of where kind of lunar robotics fall into that becomes more of an open one of what is the overall U.S. commitment to the moon going to be? In the last 8 years, or when did Artemis technically, 2019, Space Policy Directive 1 was what, 2017, 2018, which was moon. Anyway, so let's say the last 8 years-ish, 7 years, with this focus on the moon, there's been a lot of people and companies and other nations joining the U.S. in this endeavor. We have the Artemis Accords. We have high-level programmatic contributions from the European Space Agency, Japan, United Arab Emirates for elements and hardware. We have, I think the U.S. has made a deal to have the Japanese will be some of the first non-U.S. astronauts on the surface of the moon in future Artemis landings. We have, of course, the human landing system with SpaceX and with Blue Origin. We have the commercial lunar payload services and a whole broad goal to establish a cislunar economy. And so a lot of companies, private companies, have sprouted up, assuming that that will be U.S. policy and that we will have this enduring commitment to a sustained presence at the moon. That was provided an outline in this concept of there's national interest at play that we address by doing this. All of the discussion about adding Mars has so far touched on none of that. And this goes maybe to the heart of what are we trying to do? What's the administration want to do with a public space program? For what reasons? And if we're going to now talk about humans to Mars, and also, of course, there's the whole competitiveness with China's growing ambitions in space, and particularly with their interest in the moon. So the question becomes, where does Mars fit into this? Is it replacement? Is it additive? Is it something completely off to the side? Does it present itself as a special interest or giveaway? Suddenly, with absent this larger national discussion, it becomes harder to analyze where Artemis falls in. So I think we can go out on some limbs here and just speculate, and you can call me to account in a couple of years and see where this lands out. A dangerous thing to do, I know, but there's a good chance that large portions of U.S. commitment to the moon, I think, remain because of what Jack was saying, that we still have a Congress, and we have in legislation now that would have to only be changed by subsequent legislation that the U.S. is going to the moon and Mars, right? Ultimately to Mars. So maybe they can tweak that and part, to speed that up. And you need to have some kind of consensus to change it because the Senate still has the filibuster, which means that there has to be 60 votes to pass legislation. and even to pass to move forward appropriations bills. So that means that you have to have some Democrats. They'll have 52 or 50, probably 53 Republicans in the Senate. That means they'll need at minimum 7 Democrats to move most policy forward, meaning there has to be some kind of consensus. And of course, Republicans themselves will have opinions on space. And so there's a broader set of things that have to still happen, that even if the White House or Trump wants to move on a certain, shift things around, they'll have to still go through some kind of legislative process. How exactly that looks like and what the interests are going to be and what types of horses are traded, we'll see. But the commitment to the moon has been sustained for so long that it would leave a lot of our allies hanging. It would leave a lot of commercial companies hanging. It would leave a lot of investors hanging, and a lot of politicians who've been talking about maintaining parity with China and other things out in the lurch. So there's a lot of built into that. So that's all a long way of saying, I don't know about the robotic aspect, because it kind of depends where our national commitment, whether it remains fully on the moon or if we start pivoting to Mars on top of that, and we can go from there.
Well, the element I want to add, the sort of another confounding variable in all this, is that the robotic element of Artemis is housed within the Science Mission Directorate under LDEP, the Lunar Discovery and Exploration Program, and specifically the Commercial Lunar Payload Services, or CLPS program, within that. And so this is, again, a long-standing priority for the nation to send humans back to the moon. Part of that is sending robotic precursors, and that has been seen as, instead of the Apollo-style moonshot, where it is government center-run robotic precursor missions, although Ames and Johnson are building things like the Viper mission, the actual landing services are being provided by a commercial contractor. And so that's your Firefly and Astrobotic and Intuitive machines. But all that funding is wrapped up in science. And so if the funding for science goes down, there's going to be less opportunities to prove out some of those robotic capabilities and do those studies of the South Pole region, which the whole reason that was selected is based on this theory that there is significant enough water ice at or beneath the surface to sustain long-term human habitation on the lunar surface in the near future. If we don't do those robotic precursors, it's going to be great to send astronauts there, but there's this whole sustainability key, right, to this whole endeavor to send humans back to the moon, at least in the Artemis architecture, hinges on these robotic programs also being well supported, in addition to all of the other deep space exploration that is happening within the Planetary Science Division, within astrophysics, the monitoring of the Earth's climate through Earth science, and monitoring of our host star through heliophysics. There's all of these programs kind of wrapped up within science, all contributing in part to understanding our place in space, but also laying the foundation for future exploration of humans deeper into space.
And I think that's where you could see, if policy shifts a little bit to maybe downplaying the sustainability aspect of the moon to just getting to the moon faster than China, you would have the moon remain, moon to Mars, but the whole sudden, it reframes all of the investments, and that would then, exactly to what Jack was saying, undermine some of the robotic contributions because they would no longer be as critical to that sustainability. So there's a lot of ways this can change, and literally we have almost no information to work on. Oh, and so I just want to emphasize that we have we're trying to maintain a certain amount of humility here, but it's worth exploring the potential, the bounds of where we could go. And this is really, I think this is why we are answering these questions right now.
And here, some of us were beginning to hope that the moon versus Mars question had been taken care of.
It never dies. We will do the
We will always fight.
We will exhume my body, or I'll be like Frank Poole in 3001. In 1,000 years, they'll still be arguing about the future of moon versus Mars. Recover me from space.
We are getting lots of questions that directly address this, and I hope that what you're hearing is helping to answer some of your questions, folks, as I look through these. And you also, in your article at planetary.org, Casey, talk about some of the things that could fall to a department that isn't a department, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency that will be, we are told, run by Elon Musk and a guy who ran for president for a little while. For example, Paul says, I think NASA's Gateway plan is a good one. Moon and Mars become accessible, but it will take some time. And then added, if Gateway were abandoned, what would follow ISS? You do talk about this in your piece, Casey, because you have to think, when you look at a couple of guys who want to eliminate waste, and you look at the money that's gone into SLS, in spite of the nationwide support for that big rocket that you guys have talked about so many times, the Gateway, Orion, SLS itself, are these potentially on the chopping block?
Yes, I think so. I think they would be to some extent in any administration coming in, given that the job of a normal transition, you have these teams, these like landing parties or transition teams for every government agency, goes in, kind of peeks under the hood, you know, checks it all, checks the oil, the engine lights, whatever, and reports back to the incoming administration like, these are the problems, these are the opportunities, these are the things to be aware of. Much like with when Obama came in, they ended up canceling Constellation because that project was in a lot of trouble. So let's add this. So the X factor, of course, then is the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which is not a department. It is probably going to be a commission. They actually haven't even stated that, because calling it a commission actually triggers a number of conflict of interest legal requirements about the people running it. And obviously Elon Musk has a lot of conflicts of interest. So right now it's unclear exactly what it is. And so that, again, it's hard to model because this is unusual in that we have a very tight currently relationship between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. But if you just abstract everything out, what we know on paper is that Elon Musk and Ramaswamy have been told to write a report on government efficiency to be delivered in a year and a half. Yeah. That is the extent that, like, just pulling everything else out of that is what they are being told to do. So in some ways, that doesn't sound very impressive, right? There's been lots of government cutting commissions, efficiency commissions. We have the Government Accountability Office, which I think, what is that, 1921 from the 1920s, that's says how to make government more efficient every year. That is ignored. Obviously, Elon Musk is very wealthy and runs X/Twitter and has a political PAC and can, the ear of the president. So there's a bit different of a relationship here. But he himself isn't even fully in charge of it, right? He's co-leading this, which I think is already, I don't know, we're a bit of a criminology about reading too much into that. However, so, I mean, at the end of the day, they released this report in June of 26, feeds into the fiscal year 27 budget request that is then released in, this would be the 28 budget request, which is then released in the spring of 27. Then you have less than 18 months left on Trump's second term. So, I mean, that's one way of looking at this, that this may just be nothing, right? Or very not influential.
Yeah.
Or maybe it will be. I mean, and that's the thing. So maybe there'll be some unprecedented relationship. They'll rapidly try to do it. But either way, you cannot, again, and this is why it's just, if you hear me trying to stumble on my words and be careful and trying to account for the uncertainties here and acknowledge, and I think we have to try to keep a bit of a level head, because there's a lot of excitement right now. And at the end of the day, all we know is that they'll write a commission report in a year and a half that, through any normal process, would then get folded into the budgeting process the following year. And if they're demanding massive cuts in various programs, suddenly every state and every senator and every member of Congress and representative, everyone else's waste is someone else's critical local district program. And this is why it's hard to do. It's not a trivial problem. this is all exists for a political reason. So do they have the focus, the drive, the tenacity, and the ability to do the consensus building? Because again, remember, these are filibusterable bills. So you need some Democrats. Do you have the ability to drive a consensus to do this for the next 3 years? Maybe. There's a double X factor, an X to the power of X factor, which would be this concept of the impoundment clause, which is a law by Congress that clarifies constitutional authority of Congress. It has the power of the purse. You can spend money up until I think 74. Is that when it was part of the Budget Control Act, Jack, that this came out?
1974.
That particularly Nixon was somewhat notorious for declining to spend the money appropriated to certain programs by Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Congress clarified that that's not the case, that if money is appropriated, the executive branch's responsibility is to execute the law, not to decide what the law is. The Trump campaign has argued that no, that's wrong, that they have the right to not spend money appropriated by Congress. So that would be a radical reinterpretation of the role of the executive branch and further consolidate a significant amount of power and basically give the White House a line item veto or arbitrary veto to not spend money on anything it sees fit. That would be probably a Supreme Court case, and even with a conservative Supreme Court, I think would be unlikely to win. So given that fact, you have to kind of see this whole Department of Government Efficiency will have these potentially long-term consequences. But again, are they doing these things that I identified? Are they being focused, driven, and are they building the consensus? And maybe focused and driven is happening now. I have yet to see consensus efforts being made. And in fact, antagonizing the party out of power, which you would need to pass any legislation, even now, and may regain some power in the midterm elections in 2 years, at which point you're proposing your cuts, doesn't seem the most strategic thing to me. So long way of saying probably not as impactful as it might seem. But again, there are experts out there who disagree with me on that. And I think it's going to be a real issue of how much the executive branch will try to really focus this and how much of Elon Musk's time will be focused not just on NASA and everything else as opposed to NASA, and what will NASA receive on this. Jack, you want to talk? I mean, there's also the question about the SLS,
which I think is also a great example of something that was baked into the U.S. code, right? Starting with the 2010 authorization, that the Space Launch System was going to be the sole launch vehicle for human exploration, right? For the U.S. government. And so I think there's these long-standing traditions, right, that are kind of coming to a head with what has sort of turned into we'll say, mandate for change. What that change looks like, right, is sort of taking shape as we read the news. And I will say there is a part of this that is a little bit of expectation setting. I think what we've definitely seen in the past is there's always a lot of news, a lot of the pundit class spinning up whenever any major decision is being proposed or being talked about. And then the final solution that comes out of that sort of back and forth is much different than what was originally proposed by the Trump administration. So it really, I mean, we're still within the first month of it even being the president-elect, let alone being inaugurated as president of the United States. And we have two majorities in Congress who heavily favor Republican states, right, in Alabama, Texas, and Florida, which benefit from sort of the existing Artemis architecture. But at the same time, there is also this desire to enact some level of change. And so, could we see a situation where, and I think there was a comment in the chat here that was talking about, maybe SLS is for Artemis 3 and 4, and then 5 onward is something different. That is as likely a scenario as SLS remaining the sole launch provider for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, right? And so I think for our purposes, right, as space advocates, sort of setting our expectations appropriately and talking to the people that hold the purse strings. Right? At the end of the day, Congress is as much a part of this conversation as the administration is going to be. And any major shift in policy is going to need some congressional buy-in. And there will certainly be some horse trading. Space doesn't exist in a vacuum. Pause for laughter. But there is a lot of other issues that this administration is going to be trying to enact, and space could be that bargaining chip. Maybe we keep SLS so that the administration can have some other policy win. And so there's a lot of politics happening at the highest echelons of government now with this mandate for change that could see radical change in the space domain, or it could see a continuation of the status quo. It really is too early to say one way or the other, but the speculation at this point is that there will be changes. I mean, the GAO, National Academies of Science, and the Congressional Research Service, as well as the Inspector General's office for NASA, have all identified major problems with the management and culture and technical needs of the agency. And a lot of that stems from a lot of folks leaving these centers to go work in commercial space. NASA at a Crossroads report, which is sort of backbone. That's your additional required reading. I hope everyone did the homework. Really showcases that there is a serious problem across the space sector. This is within commercial space and within civil space, that the expertise is just not, it's not in the places it needs to be. And if we're going to have these amazing launch providers like SpaceX and Rocket Lab and Firefly and all the various small to super heavy launchers, we need something to be able to put on top of those rockets, and that's science. Those are those scientific payloads. Those are those satellites that are providing views of our Earth and of places deep in our solar system and beyond. So you need to have a healthy combination of both. And right now, that imbalance is very present in the space community.
I want to build on that because again, I want to stick on this SLS issue a little more because it's going to be, I think, a big issue.
Quickly, because we have so many other questions to get to. And I know you got to leave us, Casey, in about 15 minutes.
But I think this is going to be one of the big areas. And the point is, and we may start to see signs of this soon. So I'll say first, we'll look to see who the NASA administrator nominee will be. I think that will give us a tell about what type of agency we should expect.
And we have some questions about exactly that question.
The SLS,
I do too.
Yeah, right. But the SLS, I'll just point out, is that in September 25th of this year, less than 2 months ago, fewer than 2 months ago, the House of Representatives passed their version of a new NASA authorization by a 2/3 majority, which means it had like 100 Democrats voting for it as well, that had a whole section called the reaffirmation of the SLS, and that we love the SLS, and I'm paraphrasing, but we love the SLS and it shall launch every year and nothing could be better. We just, big heart emoji, about this program. We couldn't be happier. That was a Republican-led Congress, right? A Republican-led House of Representatives. So it would, again, we will see. I think that what's going to be the tension is how much will parochial politics be challenged by adherence to a very visible and high-level populist kind of national level of politics, and is it more valuable to them to adhere to that program and say no to their party leader, or will they cancel their own programs in their districts? Other opportunities are, if there's going to be large-scale budget cuts, which there very well could be, Trump has promised to exempt Social Security, Medicare, and the Defense Department. So maybe you might see, you'll lose all these jobs with SLS, but we'll write in extra, you can train, we'll give you all these big plum DOD, maybe Space Force types of things that can transfer a lot of that. And they'll be in, Redstone Arsenal or wherever, right? So there are a number of factors. And one more thing on the SLS, because the biggest thing against the SLS right now is Starship. And I think so even just beyond what's changing this, SpaceX, SLS has been rock solid politically for 12 years. just unquestioned, like only could give them more money, right? There was never any serious effort to cancel it. But now with Starship, you have this visual, like what we'll see today, of this radical, new, far more affordable and completely innovative system that makes SLS look like a Pinto, right? And you have that, I think, even more than the fundamental openness politics is going to be really challenging. And the fact that SpaceX has set up shop Texas and Florida, right? So there, if you have new competing things, then I think it is valuable. And, frankly, not that many people will shed a tear if SLS goes away politically, from the space industry. The question is, to what Jack is saying, like, are we aligning NASA to some strategic purpose, or are we cutting it just to cut it? And what do we do with the savings? Are we reinvesting it in the space program and its workforce, or is it going to leave the agency? And that's the big open question.
I'll remind our viewers who don't need to be reminded of this, there has been exactly one SLS mission, successful mission. We are an hour and 20 minutes away from what the window opening, at least, for the 6th flight of Starship, which we will finish this program in plenty of time for those of you who want to switch over to the SpaceX feed to track that launch. And here I was worried that we might not be able to fill out an hour. We are getting so many questions.
Matt, have you listened to my podcast recently? I can't stop talking about this.
A little bit. Not surprisingly, perhaps, a lot of these questions are related to that gentleman named Elon Musk, who, by the way, seemed to be enjoying his McDonald's meal on the Trump plane much more than RFK was. Violet wrote about what happens if, with the close relationship with Elon and SpaceX, if we see it turning away from other alternatives. And from our friend Christopher Kokinos, a huge Moon fan. There are no bigger Moon fans. Author, poet. He is somebody that we all have a lot of respect for. He's just wondering if Blue Origin will be ready to take legal action if Musk pushes SpaceX in ways that seem laden with conflicts of interest. You've already partially addressed this, but there are all those others. Jack, you mentioned some. Rocket Lab, Firefly, and a little company named Boeing that is still struggling a bit, but we hope they're going to make it someday. They don't have the ear of the president-elect the way Elon seems to.
No, they certainly don't. And I think I think we could see, and we've already seen in some instances, Blue Origin and other companies take legal action against SpaceX. Right. But I think at the end of the day, right, when it comes to the legislation that goes into effect and just looking kind of big picture, right, looking at the rhetoric that's used, I think by members of Congress and by administration officials, I think there's a pretty warm embrace of there being now multiple commercial launch providers. And that was the whole point, right? Back in the Obama days of the commercial cargo and commercial crew program, when SpaceX was just an upstart, and the Obama administration came in and snatched it from the claws of bankruptcy, right, and supported the development of Falcon 1, which and eventually Falcon 9. The whole point of that sort of transition period in 2008, 2010 was to develop these domestic commercial capabilities to reduce the cost of access to space and increase reduce the U.S. reliance on, at the time, really the Roscosmos launch facilities to get humans to low Earth orbit. Now we exist in a time when you have SpaceX and United Launch Alliance, which just had their second successful Vulcan test. And so, working towards having, again, these multiple launch providers that are both human rated and for, the various robotic payloads. Really sort of exciting time, right, to have that. And I could see there being maybe some, depending on what the regulatory regime begins to look like, right? The FAA just this week started to convene a committee to look at Part 450, which is essentially their section of the regulatory code handling commercial space launches, what that regulatory regime looks like in the next 4 years. it might not be a contentious environment where Blue Origin and SpaceX are vying for, the same launch facility, or vying for resources from the federal government, if the regulatory hurdles are adapted in such a way that it is now easier to launch. Now, that also comes with it the risk, right? The both environmental and personnel risk that creates, and infrastructure risk, right? So creating that sort of rebalancing what that regulatory regime looks like, so that you have what I think Musk and SpaceX sort of view as like this sort of open road now to launch Starship as much as possible, to develop this capability of getting humans back to the lunar surface and potentially onto Mars. But I'm going to go back to what I was saying earlier. It doesn't matter how many times we can launch something if there's nothing to launch at the end of the day. And so making sure that there is a robust space program, developing that balance, not just in that regulatory regime, but one of the big challenges that the administration is going to have and the Congress is going to have is we have amazing people at the Jet Propulsion Lab, Goddard Space Flight Center, Marshall Space Flight Center, that are able to build and participate in the exploration of space robotically and with human-rated vehicles. But what we just saw this week, right? 325 layoffs at JPL, countless contractors at JPL, at Goddard, across the country. And with that sort of imbalance, right, that we're seeing, that's highlighted in the NASA at a Crossroads document. It's great that we have all these great, these capabilities, and New Glenn, right? I want to make sure to mention that New Glenn potentially launching sometime early next year. What are we going to be able to launch if not just more Starlink satellites or Kuiper satellites, right? As part of their sort of a low Earth orbit constellation, right, for broadband internet access. I think we want our space agency to be forward thinking and be able to leverage the unique capabilities that we have to land on Mars and send rovers throughout the solar system and build nuclear powered octocopters to fly and soar through the skies of Titan. That's all enabled by commercial, but led by NASA and its partners.
I want to turn outward a little bit, at least away from our own neighborhood, with a question that came in from Philip, who fears a retreat from international cooperations, especially with Europe. Any signs of how the winds may blow on this front, he asks. And didn't we just see, who was it, Denmark just made it, I don't know, God, what is it, 40-something now collaborators in Artemis? 48?
Mm-hmm. 48.
Wow. Yeah, impressive.
And Thailand will make 49. The only country to sign or to approve that they are signing both the Chinese-led International Lunar Research Station Agreement and the Artemis Accords.
So do we have any idea what the outlook is there? Well, we know that in other areas of international relations from the first Trump term, that they didn't always go so smoothly.
Yeah, but at the space level, they did. I mean, Artemis Accords was a product of the first Trump administration. So the answer, no, we don't know. And this is where I think the personnel who will occupy these roles will be very telling. And last time we had Jim Bridenstine, and we had as NASA administrator, and then Scott Pace as the executive secretary of the National Space Council. Both of them and a lot of the people around them who ended up serving at NASA and the council were very global in their thinking and loved and took seriously, maybe loved too strong a word, but they respected deeply NASA as an institution, space as a geopolitical and instrument of national interest, and were thinking in these broad, long-term strategic plans. So if we get more people like that, then I think that's great. And, again, I think it goes to the fact that Trump himself tends to delegate a lot, except for the very highest priority. Just one person just cannot hold in their head everything that the federal government does. I'm only dimly aware of everything that we do here at the Planetary Society, right, of 28 people. So I can't imagine 3 million people working, you just can't. And so to a certain degree, there is going to be some leeway and there's going to be some institutional support. And at the congressional level, there's a desire to this. Now, will that intersect with an overall clear hostility, to our European allies? Yes. I think that could be at worst, maybe it's just an indifference. At best, maybe it's an indifference. At worst, it's an active way to separate and to irritate them. But hopefully that won't happen, and space will continue to be an opportunity for that. But we just honestly don't know yet. But that could certainly play into it.
Such early days. Casey, because you need to leave us in about 5 minutes because of another commitment.
I'll do 15 minutes. I'll be 5 minutes late instead of leaving 5 minutes early.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you. Well, I was going to cut to one that I was saving for the end, but I wanted you to be able to address this, but I'll do it anyway. It comes from another old friend, Mel, and I'm avoiding last names here, folks. I don't know if you care or not. The incoming administration appears to be pushing hard to find ways to consolidate power and cut Congress out of the loop. We've all heard about the proposals for recess appointments and so on. This should come as a surprise to no one paying attention before or after Election Day. Can they get away with it? We'll see, he says. But if they do, how do we focus our advocacy? Congress today controls the purse strings. If they no longer do, this is hypothetical, but well within the realm of possibility now. Where do we focus? I want to just take those last 4 words as we head into this new era, this new administration. Where do we focus? Are you guys already starting to think about how this is going to change what you guys work on and what your priorities are?
Short answer is yes. We are certainly, Jack and I are doing a lot of behind the scenes work and discussion with other folks in the policy arena and in the space industry, just to hear what people are thinking, hear what their concerns are, their ideas for opportunities are. So first, I would just say, don't count Congress out yet. They are constitutionally embedded in our role of government. And to the degree that the executive branch does want to consolidate power, I identified 2 areas that intersect with NASA in my article. One is the reclassification of a number of civil servant positions to make them at will employment, basically that they can easily be either fired or replaced with more politically aligned individuals, so kind of sidestepping civil servant protections. And the other proposal from the campaign, I guess, was this impound clause, which they say allows them to not spend money. Both of those would be immediately subjected to lawsuits that would put them on pause. And the Schedule F is what is called the reclassifications of civil servant employees. That probably, in my mind, has a higher chance of ultimately working. But even then, that only affects tens of thousands. I mean, it's unclear. Not everyone at NASA, but probably leadership, and how that actually would impact everything. So again, we don't know. But it would cause workforce disruption. But the impound thing about the money, I don't know. You can't find to me a clearer constitutional, support for that Congress controls spending, and the executive executes laws, does not make them. I don't see that happening. Come and yell at me in 2 years if that's wrong, but but again, that wouldn't happen. That would go all the way to the Supreme Court, right? That would be an immediate thing. So that's what I'm saying. I think Congress is important. Things like recess appointments, I think we saw from the John Thune, who will assume Senate Majority Leader position, is more of a Senate institutionalist who has not committed to doing that. And ultimately, we're going to kind of run this experiment of what does Congress wish to, I guess, given the majorities or by the president's own party, where do they want to assert themselves or not? And we just don't really know the outlines of that. And at some level, there's, I think, enough, was it Hamilton, I think, was in the Federalist Papers that would argue about this kind of mutual desire for power and control would help check each other branches. And I think that's being tested right now, clearly. But there is still, I think, people who take the Senate seriously and take the House seriously. And given the very narrow majorities that both parties have, that the parties have in both houses of Congress. You will see, I think, something, the funding, I think, will still be a regular thing. How much legislating will happen, I'm not sure. I think there's a process called reconciliation, which they can pass through significant monetary policy through a simple majority vote, not subject to filibuster. But what is considered, you can't create new policies that way. And you have to hit a number of other kind of technical interpretations of being valid for that. So there's mainly tax policy is what we'll see. You can do a lot of stuff with that, but at the end of the day, Congress is still there. And so I think Congress is probably an even more important aspect of what our focus is going to be going forward, because there will be a midterm election in 2 years, and members of Congress will be asked to defend their records before their constituents, and there could be change or there could be validation of things. And so there's going to be, that'll be the first real, in a sense, public measure of approval of the policies we're going to be seeing.
Jack, go ahead.
I was just going to add in, there's another element of Congress that we're not thinking about, and that's going to be the freshman class. And this year, we are going to see a huge number. There's still, I believe, a few races too close to call, maybe at least one runoff left. But there are at least 12 to 14% of the Congress is going to be new. And just given the history of the House Science Committee, in particular, which has jurisdiction over NASA, over these big policy decisions. And I think given the momentum there is behind the NASA authorization, which, as Casey mentioned, back in September had passed by a bipartisan vote, 361 to 21, something around those lines, with the 21 not really even voting against NASA, more a procedural question. But what we're going to see is a huge number of freshmen coming in and needing to know about space and planetary exploration policy. Gives us ample opportunity to engage with these new members to talk about what it takes to have a robust space program, because it's something that I think is intrinsic to the American identity at this point, is having a space program, whether you align politically with Elon Musk or not, or with the incoming or previous administration. You see NASA as one of the best brands that this country has. And so engaging with them on how we can continue to make that strong, so that it isn't a NASA versus SpaceX, but how can these two work together to enable these great discoveries in the future. And with, I think the average tenure on the current House Science Committee, I think the average tenure is something like 2.5 terms. So these are really young members of Congress, right? Have only been there for between 4 and 6 years, by and large. And so making sure that we're engaging with these folks and any new folks that join the appropriations committees. And then over on the Senate, we've had a couple, Ruben Gallego and Adam Schiff, in particular, who represent pretty space-heavy states, California and Arizona, joining the ranks of the United States Senate and re-engaging them on what's important in space science, so that whatever committees they end up serving on, whether it's appropriations or the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, which handles NASA authorization policy, have that complete picture of what a healthy space program looks like. So, like I said at the beginning of the call, I'm heading over to the Hill for a retirement party right after this. So, we want to make sure that these incoming members of Congress have all the information they need to make informed decisions about our space program.
Yeah. I just want to say, because I'm starting to bump up, but I think Kareem asked a question here. Then I saw some other kind of questions on this too, about are we being too pessimistic about the future? And I do want to address this, because Jack and I have been talking to people literally all day by the time, so if we look a little tired, it's mainly because we've been talking about this very subject for literally 4 hours today, which I'm, again, happy to do. I could clearly do this all the time. And the point is, so yes, anytime change can be scary, right? And this is a moment where, even though if I had to be pressed up against the wall, I'd say there won't probably be huge changes, but maybe 60%. Confident of that, right? The possibility for radical change has gone up from, again, almost 0 to I don't know, 5, 10, some people say higher.
Hmm.
That isn't necessarily guaranteed to be bad. It's just going to be different. And I think the key is, and you know, we want to see if big change does happen. And we've talked about, there are a lot of issues at NASA right now. It's a lot of issues with management, and a lot of issues with workforce and infrastructure, serious problems that need to be addressed. And change could be very good for the space agency to focus on what it does best and to leverage these new tools that we have from the private sector and invest in funding and fundamental technology, science, you know, the questions, right? Why do we have a public space agency? We do it to represent our values, curiosity, openness, transparency, cooperation, ambition, you know, optimism, exploration. That's all embodied by some of these great missions that Jack has been talking about. Does NASA need to have its own rocket program? Probably not anymore, right? Will that be how politics works out? No, because we have a democracy, and the inputs to our democracy, we trade efficiency for the ability to influence what we do, right? Which is why we can't advocate to SpaceX, because they don't care what we think, right? They're a private company. They don't have to. We can advocate to policymakers. So can there be exciting change? Yes. And I think what we want to see is change happening under a clear strategic goal? What are we, to my point, right? What do we have a public, what is our public space agency trying to do? How are we using that to serve the public and national interest? If we, and then there's one other question I saw in the line there, which I do want to emphasize, which is, I do worry that the ever tightening embrace between Elon Musk and Trump with this constant focus on Mars exploration will create a sense of partisanship in something that doesn't have to be and isn't partisan in any way. There is a well-studied thing in political science. I call it like induced political opposition. If the head of your party embraces a position, your opposing party will be inclined to oppose it for no other reason than to define themselves against the party in power, right? That could easily happen, you know, for something like space that has no strong pre-existing ideological boundaries. You can shift it pretty easily if you're starting to, people see that and assume that Mars is coded as the, you know, MAGA right-wing thing, or even if you are yourself MAGA and right-wing and love the fact that they're doing that, that association that will start to identify and be related to it for people who don't share your political beliefs. That is the worst possible thing that could happen if you really care about getting people to Mars, because as Jack and I have said, it's not going to happen in 4 years. Space happens over the course of decades. And the person who best understood that were the people working for Trump in his first administration, right? That they did that work to build that consensus. And so I am concerned about that. And I'm concerned that we do have a huge opportunity to make real important change, to make government work better, to make NASA work better, to really buy in and leverage the power of our commercial sector. But we need to see well-intentioned outreach and consensus building around that. And we have to acknowledge that we do still live in a democracy, and eventually the other party will be back in power. And do you want these policies to continue in that case? And the more policies that are done by fiat through executive statements and executive power, the easier they are to undo if a Democrat becomes president in 4 years. They can as easily write those with a stroke of the pen. How you build consensus is getting legislation, which again forces that to work. This is, you know, it's not easy, it's not fast, but it can be very powerful. So there is opportunity. There is cause for optimism. The idea of watching a crash program of SpaceX trying to get to Mars in 4 years would be truly exciting, right? But we need to make sure, is that done with the national interest? How is that serving the broad needs of the public and also the broad needs of NASA? So those will be the conditions by which I will be looking for and evaluating things moving forward, and the message that Jack and I will be bringing on your behalf to Washington, D.C., like the values of the Planetary Society, exploration, optimism, right? Openness, scientific inquisitiveness, lots of exciting things that I think can resonate. And that's what we're going to be doing. So that's my closing pitch, Matt.
And before you go, if you have one more minute, Jack, I want to get to the bipartisan, bicameral planetary caucus, but before we do that, a lot of our members, a lot of the people watching this are members in large part because they want to influence that consensus that can be built or maintained in Washington. We got a question from Harry. When is the next day of action? It's coming, right?
It's a great question. And if you want to be a part of this, and you can, planetary.org/day of action, March 24th, 2025. Date's been set. Invites are out. Please, if you can make it to DC, highly recommend that you do at this pivotal moment. We're going to be within the first 100 days of the new administration, first 100 days of the new Congress. We want to make sure that they hear from their constituents, you, the person listening to this, that you care about space exploration and space science and having a sustainable and robust program that leverages those commercial capabilities to build that optimistic, forward-looking future that we all dream of. And if you come to DC, I guarantee you're going to have a blast. It's for anybody that's already come, you can drop in the chat what your favorite experience was. But for me, it's just being in a room with 100 or more other members and supporters of the Planetary Society to realize this future that we all hold so dear.
Hey, Bailey, who's a newbie, welcome. You want to know what happens on the day of action? Go to that link that Casey just posted, planetary.org/day of action, and you'll learn much more about it. Casey, I guess we got to let you go.
I got to run. I'm sorry. It's a very busy week for me, but Jack may be able to stay longer, or am I?
I can stick around for a little bit.
Okay. Well,
Great. All right.
Delightful taking your questions, and expect all of you to hear more from me and Jack in the near future. We will be calling you to action. There's lots to do. May we live in interesting times. So thank you, Matt, for hosting us today. I will see you all very soon.
Thank you very much, Casey. Thanks, care.
Casey.
Jack, how long have you got? You want to do another 10 minutes?
I can do another 10 minutes, and then I'm hopping on over Capitol Hill.
Got it over to the major part of your job. All right. So what about the Planetary Science Caucus? Does it become more important because of all this stuff we're talking about, or is it no more important than it ever was, which is a lot?
Well, I would argue that it's always been incredibly important. Now, I've spoken with both of our caucus co-chairs who both won their re-election bids in the early part of this month. And so we are planning not just for the beginning of next year. We have some stuff that we have lined up through the end of this year, through the remainder of the 118th Congress, which, hey, we still have the 118th Congress to work through. And working with them, we're going to reestablish the caucus first thing next year so we can hit the ground running in the 119th Congress and make sure that we continue to grow the footprint of our political action in DC. And so there is an action currently on the webpage. Obviously, with 14-ish% of the Congress being new, there is a pretty solid chance, maybe more so than at any other point during the year, that maybe if you sent that letter asking your member to join the caucus, they may say, "Oh, I'm sorry, but I'm retiring." But there is going to be need for grassroots action to encourage our members, because it truly is something that regardless of your partisan bent, your ideological preference, your parochial interest in space, it's something that is uniquely, or maybe at this point not so unique anymore, American. And people want to be part of space exploration. I mean, just count how many members of Congress are going to be posting on social media and posting press releases tomorrow morning about the Starship launch that's happening in a little bit under an hour. There is incredible interest, and I think capturing that and harnessing that and turning that into real political action on Capitol Hill is what the Planetary Science Caucus is all about.
And by the way, it's been pretty heavily reported today, as a couple of you have pointed out, I think, including Craig. There's a good possibility that the president-elect is going to be in Texas for this sixth flight of the SpaceX Starship. A sort of philosophical question from Kareem. Is radical change in the space program a bad thing, or could it be good too? I think we have heard over the course of the last hour plus, it could easily be both.
It could. I mean, I think there's. I think radical change in and of itself is maybe inherently. I guess benign is maybe not the right word, but it's certainly not inherently destructive. But there is going to be change, right? Regardless of what path the incoming administration takes. They are going to be implementing change. It's just on what level those changes are going to take place. And so, as Casey had mentioned, one of the key things that we're watching are in these personnel selections. So far, in the ones that we have seen for FCC chairman, for Department of Defense, for Department of Commerce, all of the areas that do have some sort of footprint in the space community. The incoming administration is going to be nominating people who are change makers. Mm-hmm. And I would assume that the person that they select to be NASA administrator and the deputy administrator, you got to remember there are multiple positions within NASA that are Senate confirmable. And so making sure that we are constantly engaging with the transition team as much as we are able to, with the incoming members of Congress and returning members of Congress, but also these new leaders of NASA. Which I can't say any names, but we've been engaging with a few of the folks that in sort of the circle of people around here know that are sort of on a tentative short list for those positions.
So I'm going to push you a little bit here because we've had at least a couple of people ask, any chance that Jim Bridenstine might be returning to that job?
I've heard that name before. Is there? What's the connection there?
He was a pilot he used to fly fighters, I think. But no, I mean, Bridenstine was pretty enthusiastic NASA administrator who we were, I think it's safe to say, a lot of us had concerns about before he took that job because of some of the views that he expressed when he was a congressman, which changed quite a bit when he took on administrator.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing going for former Administrator Bridenstine really was in how he approached that job. A lot of, not even just for his policy positions and ideological preference, but people had concerns because he was a politician, right? He was an elected official that we've never had an elected official lead NASA. And now since Bridenstine, we've had two, right? Him and Administrator
Right.
Nelson. And so I think that broke down maybe this barrier of having someone who is more politically minded lead the agency. And so Bridenstine, I think he did a great job in coming in and saying, well, where can I learn? Where are the problems? What can I help with? And really, I mean, and having sat in meetings with him, he is someone who has always approached leading the agency with a very open mind, and is very much focused on those big strategic questions for the agency. So I can't say whether or not he is on any short list, but he is a name that we hear very frequently, and he has stayed very active in the space community. For a brief stint there, he was leading the Mars Sample Return strategic review team, MSR-SRT, that NASA has stood up, sort of their independent panel to assess the 12 possible paths forward for the Mars Sample Return campaign. He has since left that panel. I'm not reading too much into that, given he has another business that he's running, an aerospace consulting company. So there is just a lot of machinations, I think, happening behind the scenes, but we are in conversation with a lot of these folks that are deemed to be on the short list.
I got to say, the couple of conversations that I got to have with Jim Bridenstine, I was impressed. He's a very likable fellow who I think, speaking only for myself, did a pretty good job there. We are pretty much at the end, and it has been pointed out that SpaceX is about to start its, if they haven't already, their coverage of the Starship launch. So, Jack, I'll just close by asking you, how do you see your job or your priorities changing? And on top of that, the follow-up, do you already sense changes in the mood on Capitol Hill, and I suppose it depends on who you're talking to up there.
It certainly does. Obviously, after every election, there are winners and there are losers, right? And and on both sides of the aisle. There were a number of longtime members of Congress who lost their reelection bids, both Democrats and Republicans, and a lot of new folks who are coming into office who are just as excited as ever to get to work. And so I think the mood on Capitol Hill, there is certainly a sense of, I don't want to say confusion, because I think that implies that there is information that some people have and others don't. I think that there is just there is uncertainty. That's a great way to put it. I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now as to sort of the path forward for space, and really for other priorities within the federal government. And so I think that there is for some offices, I think an sort of eager willingness to get to work on January 3rd. And for others, they're sort of bemoaning this part of the process because they're shut out of power for the next year or so. So we'll see where this all goes. We're keeping tabs on everybody on Capitol Hill and engaging with these new members coming in, as well as our existing contacts, and just starting to build that, like I said earlier with the caucus, just building our political capital on Capitol Hill, so that we can achieve these great things in space and really getting to the root of why we do these things. And so it's so easy for us, especially in the media environment that we exist in, to focus on negative things that are happening, that this thing is changing and that things aren't going to be the same, or that, hey, my guy lost, or whatever it is. And it's very easy to focus on those sort of negative things. What I bring to the table, what I'm hoping to bring to the table, is this optimism and passion and looking forward to the future, so that we can explore the cosmos together as one nation, as one people, and really trying to bring that optimism. And we can leverage these great commercial and international capabilities for our, and our historic and legacy capabilities to achieve really great things in space. And so sharing that optimism and being a friendly face, as someone who does government relations full time, you hate to be the guy that shows up at somebody's office every other week asking for something. I come with pictures loaded on my phone, right? Talking about, look at this new James Webb image. Look at this. We're sending a spacecraft to Titan. Do you see this image of Saturn that the JWST took? Just bringing that enthusiasm to it, because this is something that people want to be a part of. And so again, reminding myself, and I think others, that as easy as it is to slunk into sort of the, well, things are changing and there's a lot of uncertainty and I don't know what's going to happen next, and combating that with just a passion for space and science and learning and knowledge is just a great way to sort of bring the conversation back to looking towards the future.
Jack, thank you for helping us all to keep looking up. Even in uncertain times, it's that old PB&J that maybe is our biggest asset, other than people
Sure
like
is.
you. Passion, beauty, and joy, as the boss says, of space exploration. Thank you so much. Congratulations once again on that recognition, that award from the Advocacy Association in DC, which, if you missed at the top of the show, Jack has been named one of the top 20 advocates in DC for 2024. That's the kind of leadership that we have in our policy area and really across the Planetary Society, everybody. You can witness that almost every day. You certainly witnessed it also today from our Chief of Space Policy, Casey Dreier, who did have to leave us a little bit early. I'm sure that we will be able to hear continuing reports, Jack, from you and from Casey as we head toward a new era in DC. And I look forward to hearing those reports and more conversations.
I look forward to it too. Thank you, Matt. This has been a fantastic conversation, and looking forward to seeing everybody at the Day of Action. March 24th, planetary.org/Day of Action. We need you there. We need folks to sign up. So please, if you can make it to DC, do so. We'll also have some remote options for you to participate in amplifier efforts here in DC, but we need you here.
Planetary.org/day of action. Be there. Thank you, everybody, for joining in on this conversation. And I look forward to talking to you again, actually, next week, Tuesday, when at 6 p.m. on Tuesday, the 26th, we will be joined by Asa Stahl, who will introduce us to the brand new course. It's no longer called Backyard Astronomy. I think it's Stargazing 101, which go to planetary.org, or actually, what am I saying? It's only available to those of you in the member community. It's another one of those great perks for our members. Here in the community, you probably saw an announcement today, if you're watching us live, inviting you to come and enjoy that great new course by Asa. We'll do the course because then we're going to want to take your questions and comments when we talk to Asa on Tuesday. And I highly recommend the great book that we'll be talking with that, Eric Berger, God, I couldn't get it out. His sequel to his first book based on his experiences with SpaceX. This one is called Re-Entry. It is a terrific book with a very realistic view of the leader of SpaceX, Elon Musk. We're going to be talking with Eric about that book on December 6th here in the community, soon after to be made available to all of you on YouTube and at planetary.org. Again, thanks for joining us. And Jack, have a great time at that retirement party on the Hill.
Will do. Thank you, Matt. Ad Astra.
Ad Astra. Take care, all.